welcome, friends. I'm excited to be here with you guys today. Since we've started doing series together, have just walked through the 7 elements of DMM over and over and over again. And this is the first time I think we've kind of veered from that a little bit. And we just said, as we've had lots of conversations with people about, hey, how do I involve my church in this journey that I'm on? Whether you're the lead pastor or you're just going, how do I help other people and influence with them? And so, yeah, this series is called the Church Involvement Continuum. And Chris has written blogs on this. And last week he shared, not that these are the 5 ways to do it. In fact, I call mine 4.5, what we're doing. But these are 5 kind of major ways that you can involve DMM in your church, and would say, not that like there's a goal of one and the others are like steps towards it, all are a win, and are helping make disciples. And so last week, Chris shared about the first 2, the idea of blessing and just simply going, hey, we call, that's when someone says, hey, when another church is doing DMM, we're blessing that. That's great. Their churches, they count. And he also talked about release, this idea of sending out your radicals, or allowing people in your church who would get this to go be a part of DMM. One of the things I accidentally always call this, and Chris always corrects me, is these are not levels, like there's level 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Instead, these are just 5 ways of living this out. And Chris said this last week, and this is huge, that the goal is not just to listen to somebody and go, okay, they're doing that, so I'm going to copy it. That sounds good. I guess as all of us in ministry have read a book before and been like, oh, I should just do that. But the reality is, what God wants us to do is to listen to him and go, what uniquely do you want me to do as a leader of my church, or in the life you've called me to live? I read a book a couple of years ago called Church Unique, just this idea of God doesn't want carbon copy churches. He wants us to live out what he's called us to be able to do. And so today we're going to talk about the part of the continuum of hybrid. And as Chris and I were talking about it, I said, you've got to ask Roy if he could come. And many of us on this call probably read Roy's book, Spent Matches. I read it in the first couple months of being brand new to DMM, and it had a radical impact on my life. And then I just read it 3 months ago. So now I'm about 3 years in, and that actually I want to encourage you, some of the books you read early on, reread them if you've been doing this for a while. And it opened up all kinds of new things for me. It was chapter 3 or 4 about the Great Commission. I'm like, oh my goodness, there's so much stuff that I couldn't hear. I think I wouldn't have heard 2-3 years ago, that now I was ready to hear, and it was really powerful. So that's where we're going today. And Roy, has written a book called Spin Matches, as well as a book that's kind of a shorter version of it, but called Hybrid Church. And what I love about it too is he's been a mentor of mine from a distance, but he's living this out and helping lots of other people live this out as well. So Roy, you ready to roll?
I'm ready.
Okay, you're on.
Lots of friends out there that hard getting on this thing and not saying hey to everyone. So for those of you that I know, hey, good to see you. I would like to maybe, I think we got an hour, Chris, is that the deal? Okay, so I'd like to maybe make this as interactive as possible. So 2 ways to do that. There's a chat box that you all know. Jump into the chat box, put something in there. Jim, Chris, if you see a question there that you feel like stop, answer that question, feel free to. I give you that permission. So really nothing happens here unless there's sort of a dialogue. I'll tell you a little bit of my story and some of the principles that came out of my story. And then we can talk about them. When I was involved early on, Shoal Creek comes out of the Willow Creek. We might be the only Willow Creek model left in the world. We still don't do any musical worship on Sunday morning. So if you're thinking about doing what we do, I would encourage you not to do that. But we survived through this whole process and have a thriving Sunday gathering. Hands down, we don't get any transfer growth simply because when Christians come on Sunday morning and the band opens, with a song, from some rock group or something, they tend to walk out. Christians do, actually. So we regularly get people walking out of our service thinking this is not church. And it's like, well, actually, you're right. It's not meant to be church. Church is, actually something more than just a gathering. So, and it's good for you going down the road, because if you stay here, one of us is going to kill each other, and I'm willing to die on this hill and you may not be. So let's part ways, friends, and see each other in heaven. So as a result of, we still get a fair amount of non-believing people who actually engage what we do on Sunday morning. And so as we're thinking about, and I realize that it's not scalable though, it would not reach the area. We're praying regularly in our area for 300,000 people that live within about 30-mile radius. As we prayed for those people, I began to realize that this thing only has 1,200 seats and 425 parking spaces and so much room and stuff, and it's just not in the physical plant and the resources it takes to run this whole thing is not scalable. It won't reach 300,000 people. So we had to make a decision as to, we want to reach 300,000 people or just accept the fact that we could probably reach 1,000 or 2,000 or something like that. And so we chose for the 300,000 and began to look. And so that's where I ran into David Watson and began to put these things together. And so we had this thing that was moderately effective over here. We were baptizing 35 to 40 people a year, genuine non-believers having an engagement in the non-believing world, but there's still a ton of people out there. So we began to pursue this idea of what would it be like to do both things. I have an experience in a test drive with my mother-in-law in a hybrid car. She wants to buy a new car, and I suggest you might want to think about a hybrid. And in the hybrid, I have this sort of Holy Spirit moment, when I almost hit a lady, and I realized that she and I are operating in worlds that were different. I was operating in a world where people who are walking in front of cars hear the car, and she was operating in the same world, and I was in a car that didn't really make a sound when it took off. And so she almost died as a result of it. That moment just really hit me that this car has two operating systems, has a gasoline engine and it has an electric engine, and both of them work together. That became a metaphor for me to rethink what it looked like to do ecclesia through Shoal Creek. And so we began to bifurcate this thing and have these two sides. At first we called them come and go. And this idea of we all in the movement world tend to be really negative toward attractional ministry, but the fact is that none of you are involved in repulsive ministry. You're all involved in some type of attractional ministry. There's always attraction related to the gospel, and so. But I realized that this idea of collecting people at a spot on Sunday morning and having them be having this be the pinnacle of their spiritual experience was creating dependencies that would not scale the gospel and stuff. So there's all kinds of things wrong with what's happening on Sunday morning. and so I began to explore, ran into David Watson and the whole DMM world, and they took me in and treated me like a child of theirs and mentored and really let me just roam the world and get to know who they were and what they were doing. And so in that process, I started out 13 years ago, and I've had 3 different phases of learning in that process. The first phase, I came back, I was absolutely intoxicated with this 3 letters, DMM. I used it every 5 minutes. You would have thought that I was in some kind of cult. I was so hung up on the tactic itself. And so I went through a phase where I discovered the hard way that it really was not about about the solution. I was loving the solution and not loving the problem. And so that first phase was for me to understand that it's not about a tactic and selling people on a tactic, because the fact is there's so many people in my world that are going to come out with a new silver bullet. I just got back from Exponential a few weeks ago. And if you've ever been to Exponential, you know that everyone's there selling a silver bullet. And if you take their silver bullet this year, you'll be back next year and someone else will have a different silver bullet for you to take. And so I was in that kind of silver bullet mode, and I had to come back to realize that I really needed to focus people's attention on the problem and not the solution. And the problem is that I had gained the incredible privilege of relating to a father who allowed me the right to become his child. And a part of being in my father's family was helping him find the family that had not yet gathered to meet him as father. And that was the primary reason he had drew me into his family, was to be this contagious person to find my not yet brothers and sisters in the kingdom. And helping people fall in love with that problem was really important, because I made the mistake of thinking I just needed to train them in a different way of gospeling. So I needed to train them how to do discovery groups, how to invite their friends, neighbors, and relatives to sit at a table and read the Bible for themselves, build this obedience culture, build this accountable culture, and let people kind of slowly walk themselves into the kingdom, embrace Jesus, and live a kingdom lifestyle, and turn around and do the same for other people. But it wasn't just a training problem. There was something wrong at the core. In fact, I would say that upstream, we have a problem with our gospel, because we have perpetuated a kind of gospel that gets people to assent to a few facts about a moment in Jesus' life, rather than seeing the whole of Jesus's life, that he came to bring a kingdom, not just to bring forgiveness. And we spend a lot of time in that forgiveness gospel. And I had a whole bunch of people, unfortunately, that I had brought into the kingdom on the basis of that forgiveness gospel. And so they got to the cross and they stopped right there. And so we began to rethink that on the hybrid side, to help people understand what's it look like to fall in love with the problem, rather than just to fall in love with the solution, which was the DMM thing and that kind of stuff. So any questions here so far? Have I offended anybody that I need to deal with? We're good. All right. So as I went through that process of understanding that, I had to really come to grips with the fact that the training that we did on as we had this hybrid side. So Sunday morning people come. It's kind of like church, sort of, except there's no musical worship there, so it doesn't feel like church to most Christians. But it's really challenging about Jesus and the gospel and the Bible and what place they play in your life on a weekly basis. We had to build these stairways and stuff. So I don't know how many of you've seen. Was it Jim? You mentioned Church Unique, Will Mancini. Really good book. And I would say that for those of you that are working in an institution, if you're working with a church and stuff, you probably need to come to grips with the clarity issue. So if you can't take the top 10 leaders in your fellowship, and they're not saying near the same thing about the mission of your church, then you're wasting your time trying to train them in the DMM tactics. You need to get to clarity first before you try to get them someplace else. But Will has a video in which he describes upper story, lower story. Are many of you familiar with this idea of upper story and lower story that Will Mancini talks about? Yes, no? Jim obviously is, maybe Tim, yeah, okay. He talks about the lower story being people are attracted to a place, are attracted to the people, they're attracted to a personality, or they're attracted to programs. And that's what that's the kind of thing that we've built on the hybrid come side. Everybody has, and so that people get stuck in those four things. And typically we work really hard, unfortunately, to build dependency on one of those four things. So we get them in small groups and all kinds of things. And so they get stuck in that lower story and they never get to the upper story, which is really understanding their call, their call as a child of God, their connection with the heart of their Father, their place in expanding God's family in this world. All that kind of stuff is just, it bypasses them in some way. And so they become really good consumers, because that's what we want them to do, is to be consumers. And so, but the struggle is to get them to the upper story. And I would say that most of us, if we're working if you're attempting to do any kind of work with movement thinking inside an institution, you've got a lower and upper story, and you've got to understand your lower story problem and realize that to get success and traction, to get to multiplication, you're going to have to figure out how to get people out of that lower story into that upper story. So I'd go out and Google Will Mancini upper story, lower story, and find that video. It's on Vimeo at the Future Church site, if you want to get more specific at it, and take a look at that. Because as we think about this hybrid, we realize is that we have to be very careful now on our comm strategy side, where we have this collectional strategy, to start early with our language to help people understand that this is a starting point. And this is like an airport terminal. No one goes to Atlanta to just go to Hartsfield International Airport and stay, even though they've got lots of places to eat and lots of things to do there and that kind of stuff. Week in and week out, it would be a nightmare. So no one goes just to stay there. They go to get through there. So we help people understand this is a terminal. This is a pass through to get you someplace in that process. So as we think about that hybrid, there are some realities that you have to come to grips with, is that the medium is the message. And so when you gather people in a large room on Sunday and you have one person stand up and you have some people sing, they're leading, and some people not, or all that kind of stuff, you're creating dependencies. You're just necessarily creating dependencies. And if you don't start fighting hard against those dependencies early on, you'll never overcome them. I think the reality is, though, is that for most of us, when you're approaching a hybrid strategy, you've got to come to grips with the innovation of diffusion, or the diffusion of innovations research, to realize that there are 2.5% innovators, there are 13.5% early adopters, and 84% of the people on the other side. And there's a good chance that you are going to fall into that, and you're only going to have about 16% of the people who are going to go with you. And that's okay. That's all you need. I could move you around the world and tell you movement stories of spaces that started with very few people and have ended up with a lot of people. And so you don't need many people, but you do need them to rethink themselves and understand what it looks like to gospel, not as forgiven Christians, but as kingdom Christians, as people who want to multiply and see, having children and grandchildren in the spiritual world is natural, and that they, as an ordinary person, can actually do that. You've got to get them to that space so they realize that that's possible, and the kinds of equipping that you're going to do is going to release them. And they're not going to go back to this place on Sunday morning necessarily. They'll be in a network, a coached network, mentored, never alone, all those kind of things. But their orbit back to a Sunday morning may never be again. They may be released and out into a network. So at Shoal Creek, we have this Sunday morning gathering, and we have a Shoal Creek network. And so this network attracts people to identify circles of accountability. So we attract people to find callings in life. And so we have a group of widows who focus on suddenly widowed women, and they are roaming around our area trying to find collections of them. And so they ran across a bunch of women who volunteered at a thrift store, who 30 plus widows, and just so happened that we knew the manager of the thrift store, and so he became a team member with them to be able to plant the gospel in those folks. We had a couple who has a love for pickleball, like that, Chris, and as a result of that love for pickleball, they wanted to plant the gospel in this. I live in the little suburb of Kansas City called Liberty, and Liberty has a Parks and Rec League, and they meet on Monday and Thursday nights at this pickleball complex. And so they began to target that. They're just about to start their first group in that pickleball group. We've got a group of men and women who focus on our local jail here, and they're Mondays and Friday nights, they're leading discovery groups inside the jail, and they have a thing called Share the Hope, a Saturday morning expression of ecclesia, church for the ex-incarcerated, and as they continue to move back into life. So we've got all of these bridge experiences that we're pushing people toward, hopefully realizing that they'll come on Sunday morning, have this conversation, but early on in their experience, we expose them to this upper story, lower story thing, and help them understand that if they get stuck at people or place or personality or programs, their spiritual journey will never, ever be what God intended it to be. And so we help them think in terms of those categories and look for those stairs quickly as they move into our spiritual realm of things. Again, I'm going to take a breath here. Questions or comments, criticisms? Let's see.
Jim Thurber asked, "Hey, please be more specific about falling in love with the problem."
Okay.
What do you mean by that?
So I think that the heart of the Father is absolutely central to understanding the gospel. Coming to grips with what God did in the sending Jesus and drawing us into his family, and being stunned by his grace on a regular basis, and the privilege that we have of being his children. We talk to people about the fact that oftentimes in my early life, I just, we all pick up this sort of evangelical lingo and stuff. And I would be talking with people and talking about having a personal relationship with God. And I remember talking with this one fellow who's particularly lost. And he says to me, well, I said, you don't need to worry with me. I've got a relationship with God. And it's like, well, so you just spent the last hour telling me about 5 women that you've slept with this month. And you have, struggled, with some addiction issues and that kind of stuff that you've talked to me about. But you have a relationship with God. And it's like, it's like, yeah, it's like, what is that really? Well, I'm, when I'm out in nature, that kind of stuff. So it helped me reformulate my thinking, is to understand that people do have a relationship with God, and that is a creature-creator relationship. And my job was to help them get a father-child relationship, help them change their relationship with God. And so to help them have a John 1:12 experience, to as many as showed hospitality to Jesus, that is lambano, to as many as received Jesus, let him into their house and treated him as a guest, as an honored guest in their house. To as many as did that, he gave them the right, the authority to be children of God. And so they became his children. So falling in love with that Father and what he did to make that possible, and why he did that to make that possible, and what he wants for our world, what he's been trying to do since he entered time and space, and that is to have a family. There's a great book that rethinks biblical history called What Does God Want? And it builds this theology of family that's starting from Genesis through the book of Revelation, that God has been about building a family. And so we help people understand that that's what God is about. He's building a family, and you've been drawn into the family to help him build his family. And so that's what's falling in love with the Father means for us. John or Luke 15 has been, enormously important in that process of understanding the heart of the Father, looking, specifically in verse 20 and following, where we see the Father standing on the edge of town waiting for his son. Those kinds of things are really, valuable to us to help people have those kinds of experiences and understand who God is and what he's doing in their life and what he wants to do through their life. So Henry Nouwen's book, Return of the Prodigal, is really helpful. Go ahead, Chris.
Hey, Roy, one thing I was going to ask, forgive the noise now in the background of the nail gun. I talked about this with Bless and Release, and we'll talk about this with the others, but what would you say is the commitment level required to embrace some kind of a hybrid approach? Like, what if you're the youth minister, but the senior pastor isn't on board? What level of commitment is required on the part of the church staff or the leadership of the church to implement some kind of hybrid approach, would you say?
Well, I think there maybe, if I could bifurcate that a little bit and just say, if you're trying to institute a multiplicative strategy institutionally, then a lot of commitment has to be there, because you're gonna have to constantly fight things. So I would say that, first of all, if that's your posture and you're kind of doing it institutionally, you ought to do some things. Like you ought to look. I have a thing I call the red dot exercise. Is like, where are you right now? All right, where are you in terms of the culture that you're in? Because the second thing I would say that outside of falling in love with the Father or the Father's heart is the fact that this is a culture building business. This is not skill or training business. And so you are literally trying to change a culture. It's almost impossible to change culture. So you've got to move to some space where you can create a new culture first. You can't change the whole culture. So if you're a student minister, for instance, I wouldn't try to change the student ministry. I would take a few kids who might have, like your radicals, Chris, that you talk about. I would take those and I would do that alongside there. And I would work with the radicals and attempt to build them, into a unit, a gospel terrorist unit, to be able to move, with the gospel and plant it in ways that you don't do through, traditional youth group type ministries. I think that red dot thing is just about identifying the culture that I exist in. Every one of us, if you're involved in any kind of local fellowship that collects people at any time, mostly Sunday mornings, you've got some language, you've got some strategies that you've built about invest and invite and all those kinds of things. All that's culture. And you're coming along and saying, no, we don't want to invest and invite anymore. You might be a go and plant person and not an invest invite person. And so you've got to be clear in your thinking about what you're doing, because if you're not clear, people just hear blah 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 blah, and so that's why it's important, I think, to really understand where you are and decide where to work. If you're working with the whole thing, then man, you better go back to Church Unique. You better understand and sink this entire institution down in some clear understanding. Are they built on the Great Commission? Are they really focused on propagating the gospel in a generational way? My guess is that most of our churches aren't. They're committed to surviving. They're committed to a Sunday morning thing. They're committed to a little bit of growth. And so we exchange multiplication for growth. And you've got to come to understand that, okay, leave the growth people over here and go over someplace and try to find a space where you can get a few people to focus in on multiplication and really change their mindset about what does it look like to gospel in that world. So it's a culture building business, and culture is not built with large groups. So you've already built a culture there, and it's really hard to change that culture. And so for me, if you come here to Shoal Creek, you might not even see me. We've got a teaching team of 6 people. I speak every once in a while, but last night I had 17 people in my living room that represent 6 circles of accountability. And we're going great gangbusters. And that's where a lot of my energy, I've been released to put a lot of my energy into the Shoal Creek network. And it happens under the radar. I mean, we do let it come up, and we do put it in announcements and on the app and that kind of stuff, but people know about it. But we don't put a lot of energy in trying to turn the whole ship on Sunday morning toward this kind of thing. We're off working with a smaller group of people, the radicals, and we're infusing them with it. And my salary gets paid by Shoal Creek. That's the way this big engine over here funds what's happening out in the community. So I don't know if that I answer your question there, Chris, or not, but
Roy, that's helpful. And then one follow-up, one thing I did with Bless and Release, and we'll do the next 2 weeks, is kind of what is the commitment level required of the pastor or the pastoral staff? And then secondly, what are some of the costs involved? And I don't mean financial necessarily, but just the costs involved. I know it's not, especially as you look at hybrid or some of the ones we'll talk about in the next couple of weeks, they're, at least under Release last week, we talked about how if you release some of your radicals, you may lose some of your best givers or lose some of your best volunteers. Not lose them, you're sending them. It's a good thing, but there's a cost involved. What would you say are the costs you've seen with the hybrid approach, and what others might see with implementing a hybrid approach? What would you describe are some of the costs?
I think you have to change your speaking style on the come side, the gathering, to be consistent with having. So you have to understand what it's like to speak in multiplicative terms rather than to speak in terms of typical Christianity. And that's hard for us to do. We have to really examine all of the language. That's why that red dot exercise is looking at what language do you use right now that is getting in the way of what you want to do. You have these aspirations to be multiplicative, but the fact is that what you say and what you want are 2 different things. And so self-awareness, self-evaluation, a ruthless of self-evaluation is necessary, because you just can't do business as usual on the attractional side. You've got to change your posture and your stance. So that's why, for instance, we have a speaking team now. I used to do 80% of the speaking, and Shoal Creek used to be all about Roy, and it was kind of a culture built around my personality and that kind of stuff. And we said, okay, we can't have this multiplicative side. We can't build this network if we build this dependency over here. And so we had to obliterate that dependency. Same thing with groups. We decided that the idea of a long-term group, people doing life together and all that kind of stuff was really counterintuitive or worked against our desire to see people move into multiplicative things. And so we don't do extended groups on that side. We do small, short bursts of experiences, and they're all built to be launching pads to get people into the multiplicative side. So changing our language over there is really, really hard, and getting everybody, even, we have 3 guest speakers, or three people on our teaching team that aren't at Shoal Creek on a regular basis. They're in our city. So I see Rob Wegner's name over here in the chat. Rob's one of them. And so we've had to work really hard with Rob and Dan Diebel and Shabu Matthews to say, okay, you guys have got to understand our language and understand, what it looks like to really want people to leave the space you're talking to them in. And typically, most of us have been trained to come there and prepare messages and design services that draw people back. And so it's like, no, we somehow want to empty this auditorium. And we want to put people out there where they live, learn, work, and play, and have them investing and planting the gospel. And that's our goal here. So this is temporary. And so what does that do to change our thinking here? And it's a radical, way of looking at things.
Roy, Mo asked a question and then somebody messaged me and said they had the same question. Do you see that there in the chat?
Yeah, about the Casey Underground.
Yes, sir.
Yeah. I love those guys. Corey Osmond, one of my disciples, he took DMM into the Casey Underground, helped them understand it and build their missionary cycle and that kind of stuff. I would just say that if you're in that mode of trying to find all those missional orphans that are out there that, when 3DM didn't work out that well and all that kind of stuff, and you're trying to create those missional communities and stuff, you can never get to movement by focusing on form first. You must always focus on function, and function has to captivate and be the driving engine for things, and then form follows function. And so you can't just go out and build a bunch of micro churches with Christians and put them in there and train them in DMM and expect that something's going to happen. Their core DNA was attractional in that sense. It was about gathering together as Christians. It wasn't about reaching lost people. It wasn't about, an obedience-based, accountable structure like a discovery group that could reach people. So you have to be really careful in how you're forming things, because if you form people with this kind of form stuff, it'll be very difficult to get them into an idea of multiplication. And I'm open to questions about that. Does that make sense, Mo? Whoever else asked that? You want to ask a follow-up question or?
Yeah, Roy. My main I think obviously didn't state it well, is the ability of missional communities. And I hear what you're saying, what comes first, but the ability of that missional community structure, if you will, to be a delivery mechanism for DMM. And then in terms of what we're talking about today, I think it could have some crossover to hybrid and the things you're talking about as well. But yeah, that was it.
Yeah, so I would just, it's a delicate balance of making sure that you get function first. If you get a missional community together and then they get a mission, and in fact, in my experience, here in Kansas City, we have thousands, maybe not thousands, hundreds of missional communities that were really great communities, but very little mission. And so, like, for instance, in Brian Sanders' book, Micro Church, he has a really good balance of the three things that have to be there. I would restate them as obedience, as community, and mission. And those three things have to be there. And so we get a bit of obedience, we get a lot of community, and a little bit of mission. And that's not the recipe for movement or multiplication. There's got to be fundamentally an idea at the beginning that we're going to go reach lost people. We're going to, if you're using, a DMM tactic, you're going to use discovery groups, you're going to use discovery process, discovery Bible study, however you term that, and we're going to invite our friends and neighbors to the table. We're going to read the Bible together and discover what God has to say about life, and we're going to build community out of that. That piece has to be functionally at the beginning of everything, because if the form gets out there, and so like I mentioned last night, we had these 6 teams here. And when I call them teams, that's a euphemism. They're just like three widowed ladies who are going and reaching these other 30 lost widows they found at a thrift store. I could put them into a group and have them meet on a regular basis, and they could be a community and stuff. But they have communitas right now because they're, and I hope you all know that term from Alan Hirsch, but this idea of, because they're going on community together to reach these ladies, there's a real bond there. Like even the guys that our jail ministry just started, and the Monday night was their first night actually in the jail with the inmates, and I mean they were lit. They were just excited, and I just told them, I said, look guys, you need to understand, bottle this, because you're discovering something. The secret that most Christians miss is that when I pour out my life, God fills it up. You feel filled up right now because you spent 4 hours in the jail dealing with all the rigmarole of people having to be frisks every 45 minutes, moving in and moving out, and all kinds of disruptions. But you had a chance to be face to face with some people who you felt like were receptive to the ministry and the message of Jesus, and they felt filled. They don't meet together regularly. They don't really, have community together, that kind of stuff. But because they're going together to plant the gospel, that they have a bond. We're going to let the disciple making process flourish before we shape them into a community. Unfortunately, on the missional community side, we tend to shape them into a community and then hope that we can get them to go do disciple making.
That's really helpful, Roy. Thank you. Lily had said this too. She said, attraction ministry sounds interesting. Could you elaborate a little bit more? Lily, do you want to ask any more specifics to that? You're asking about attraction ministry?
Let me find her to unmute her, Jim.
Oh.
Okay, she should be able to unmute now. Lily, if you want to follow up on that.
Okay, thank you. No, I just was curious. That seemed really attractive, right? Attraction ministry. So I guess the way how I interpret it is that it is really based on relational, if that's correct. When you say attraction ministry, how we attract certain people to our ministry, is that what you mean, or is that totally something different? Okay.
You're muted, Roy. Sorry, you got to unmute. I had to remute everybody to unmute folks.
Unmute. There we go. Okay. Am I live now again? Typically, we think about, a ministry, and we call legacy ministry the legacy church, the prevailing church, all those kinds of things. We will refer to them as attractional ministries. They're trying to attract people to a space on Sunday morning where one really talented person can get up and make the gospel sound really good, and hopefully, encourage them to, engage in Jesus and stuff. So that attractional ministry is just a way of looking at it. But I would prefer to think about that as collectional ministry. We collect people in spaces and we give them messages that we hope that will stimulate their growth, as opposed to distributed ministry, where we actually distribute the children of God amongst people and let them plant the gospel. At every level, any kind of gospeling is always attractional. I mean, it just, you just can't build a relationship with someone being repulsional. you know, in a sense. I mean, it's always there's always some attraction that's there. So I don't think that word really helps us much in making that distinction, but I think collection versus distribution does.
Roy, Rob had asked, hey, as you talk about having short-term small groups, how do you encourage long-term relationships with this multiplicative mindset?
You know, I don't, some of the guys that sit in my living room last night, I've known for 20 years. So I guess when you're engaged in reaching lost people, there's a bond that develops over time that you don't have to organize that kind of relationship. It happens. It's just a part of hearts being melded together. And so I think, you know, there's a false sense of the fact that we can be sociological engineers with people. We have a society that's living, you know, individual lives that are just really living, you know, separate and individualistic. And the idea of being built for community is something we've lost. And so, I mean, our culture is kind of beginning to recognize that and sort of move back toward it. But I think as we move forward, you know, we have coaching relationships, we have mentoring relationships, we have all kinds of things going on. It's just that the structure of the sociological structure of small groups in the churches, I think, generally speaking, or maybe specifically speaking, I hesitate because this thing is being recorded, is a bust. You know, I mean, it's just it just hasn't produced. It's an assimilation tool. It's not a relationship building tool. You know, and movements are relationship thick. There are, you know, tons of coaching and relational connections and stuff that happen, and that's where the lifelong relationships get built.
Rob, do you want to comment on that or question?
Yeah, I appreciate that. And Roy, I do appreciate that very much. I mean, because I see this as there's an epidemic of isolation, especially among men. It's one of the biggest problems or felt needs that guys have in the business community is, but I also agree with what you're saying that the way to create friendship isn't, you know, maybe necessarily to conduct some sort of a sociological experiment and to say, stick people in a room and say, these are your friends, you know, but to actually have something that you share together as a mission, something that you work on together that binds you together. So I can see the disciple making, like as you're focusing on disciple making, that creates friendships and creates enduring friendships. I guess I just, my ears prickled a little bit when you said, like, you know, life groups are no good, because I want to see men build real friendships, and we're really good at avoiding friendships and accountability. And so that's just, I'm trying to work through that as I'm trying to also process the you know, disciple making strategy.
So if I left you with anything today, there's a couple of words that I would love to stick in your mind like splinters. You know, one is dependency. It's like, think of dependency as cancer, and you want to eradicate this cancer at every level, at any moment, anytime you see it. You know, building dependency is the antidote for multiplication, to say it in a negative way. You know, so when you have dependency, you do not have multiplication. So you can't have dependency. You know, that's really important to get in that sense. We, and another word is catalyst. What does it mean to be a catalyst? And I love what Harry Brown, good friend and mentor of mine, says. Catalyst means it cannot happen without you, but it must not depend on you. So, you begin to realize this idea that it cannot happen without you. So you are necessary in the process, but the way you work you need to be sure that it does not depend on you. So Rob, to give you maybe a practical illustration, instead of focus on men's groups and men's ministry and that kind of stuff, we do things like we have a summer experience where we'll take 10 guys to Gettysburg, and we'll walk around the battlefield and talk about what it's like to learn from the great leaders that were on that battlefield. And at night they'll sit around a campfire and they'll be involved in really intense relationships and stuff. And what the experience that we built for them is they go through and they build a banner that would be held by the part of the legacy of Gettysburg is that, for those of you that know that, maybe I'm repeating myself, but, to give an order to flank right, flank left, there, each regiment had to have this banner, this standard that was there. And so it had to be standing or the orders couldn't be taken. And so every guy in that regiment knew that if that guy went down, he did not have a gun. He was not shooting, was not defending himself. He was simply holding the banner. If that guy went down, I threw my gun down. I went over and I picked up the banner. The banner was that important that the Army could not function without that banner. So we helped them build the banner. What does your banner look like? What are the values of your family? What do you want your family to follow? How do you want to see them, move in that? When we come back from that, we don't form them into groups and stuff, but they naturally have these kind of intense relationships that build out of that kind of stuff. So let's see here. We're about done, aren't we?
Yeah. Let me add one here from David. He says, I think you're beginning to convince me that it's really hard to create a hybrid church, especially from an existing legacy church. Do you still think that working towards a hybrid church is the best use of our time if we're committed to seeing a disciple making movement?
Well, I would say it's the best use of my time. I think, Chris and I have had these conversations together. We're both founders, right? So I'm founder at Shoal Creek, and someone comes along and says, "Hey, I don't like the way you're doing things at Shoal Creek." And I always will say, I was here before you. And so you can always go start your own thing if you want to have a say. And so I have a large amount of capital in the bank to be able to do what I do. So for me, this works really well. People know that they know the hill I'm going to die on. And if they don't want to die, they will not come up that hill. And so that works for me. Does it work for everybody? I would say, no, it doesn't. There are equally difficult tasks to be had if you leave your church and you go try to start something. It is a large climb up a hill. So I would say that when you begin to look at things, the raw material that you have to work with in terms of the Christians laying on the ground around you, they all have been infected by an ineffective gospel. And so whether you're in a local church setting or you're outside a local church setting and you're working with people who are already convinced and you're trying to re-engage them, you're going to have a lot of the same problems everywhere. But inside an institution, there's a tendency for us to think that people are going to follow us over a cliff. But the fact is, if you're not the founder, there's really not much chance that they're going to follow you over a cliff. They will follow you to the edge of the cliff. They will applaud for you as you go over the cliff. They will pray for you as they see you falling off the cliff, but they will not go over the cliff with you. And so you've got to understand there's only a small crew of people in that legacy body, the radicals, the innovators and the early adopters. And if you focus your time on there, it could be the best use of your time. But I think that's an individual decision, that each of us has to make.
Good. Hey, here's my personal last question. You just said at the beginning, you've gone through 3 stages with DMM. The first one was you're obsessed with it. Could you really quickly share what stage 2 and 3 for you?
So the first, I fell in love with the problem, not the solution and not the problem. The second was to understand that I was not in the training business, but I was in the culture building business.
Got it. Okay.
And I was trying to train all of Shoal Creek. And I mean, there are hundreds of people that know how to lead discovery groups, that understand discovery, all kinds of stuff, but none of them have ever multiplied. So I was training everybody. And that third piece is now realizing that because I'm in the culture building business, that I have to turn a DMM flywheel. And I have to keep turning that flywheel. And for us, it's a different type of training. We call it the habits training, the heart of the father in the middle. And you have to keep turning that, because it's culture building, and people pick up culture little bitty pieces at a time. That they don't get it in one training session or one set of, the training rubrics and that kind of stuff. It has to be delivered over time, repeated. Some business people will say that people hear what you say the first time when you said it 7 times. So the 7th time, boom, so.
Roy, thank you so much, man. This was really helpful for us. And so thanks for joining us today and helping us.
Oh, you're welcome.
Understanding these things. And guys, if you've not read Spent Matches yet, I think that's a requirement if you're on this journey. So get that book. And Chris, I think take us to groups. Let's go through our normal questions.
Thanks, Roy. You guys give Roy a virtual round of applause there. And Roy, I know you got to get, so come back and hang out with us again. We love having you every time.
Man.
God bless.
Keep it up. Keep it up. Keep it up. We need 1,000 of you, 1,000 times 1,000 of you. So I appreciate so much what you guys are doing.